things are considered. I'm Peter Lavelle. To remind you, we're discussing the Crimean vote. Okay, George, I'll go back to you in London. As we're all speaking here right now, the last votes are being counted. I think we can all rest assured that it's going to pass. So, what does Washington and Brussels and London and everybody else do tomorrow?
Well, I think they'll have to accept the democratic decision of the people of Crimea. They're not going to go to war with Russia. The sanctions that they're talking about will boomerang very badly upon them and hurt their own economies, which, my goodness, are in a powerless condition. So they'll just have to accept it. And I think they'll be able to accept it. The main problem will be, as Dmitry said earlier, if the provocations of the right sector and Svoboda continue in the Ukraine against the overwhelmingly Russian-speaking people of the east of Ukraine, Russia will be forced to take other measures, and those other measures might take us into very dangerous waters indeed. So if I was in the Foreign Office behind me, who knows, maybe one day I'll get there. If I was in the Foreign Office behind me, I would take the decision to just bite my lip and accept that the gamble that they took in backing the coup in Kiev hasn't wholly come off, and that Crimea has to be put in the debit balance column.
You know, Dima, again, you know, we see Washington fumbling all of the time. I mean, Syria comes to mind here. I mean, what happens the next day? We've heard so much bluster out of media and Western politicians. McCain was mentioned here. I mean, can they eat their words? And if they will eat their words, how will they reflect upon their policies?
Well, the problem is that the sanctions, when we talk about sanctions, those sanctions which can be imposed on Russia without any price to pay from the Western side, these sanctions have already been imposed long ago.
Yeah.
I mean, if we look at the main measures that the EU is going to take, first, it's going to cancel negotiations on the visa-free regime between Russia and the EU. I remind you that these negotiations were started on Putin's initiative back in 2003. They drag on for 10 years, and they will drag on for 30 or 40 years more. There is absolutely no pain for Russia in stopping these negotiations right now. And the second thing that they did is to cancel negotiations on the new partnership and cooperation agreement. Again, I remind you, this agreement was signed in 1994, it expired in 2004, and since then we could not elaborate the new agreement with the European Union, because this new agreement will have to be ratified by the parliaments in such countries as Poland or Estonia or Latvia, and I don't think they will ratify any agreement except the one saying that Russia is a criminal state and, you know, all the story. So the problem is that by being so confrontational with Russia during the last at least 20 years, the Western powers have limited their capacity to impose sanctions. What can they do? Okay, they can stop buying Russian oil and gas. That would be an economic disaster for the European Union. Or they can stop selling Russians, you know, the consumer goods, the luxury goods that they're selling now, and this will hit the European Union's budget. So by their own policies, they made themselves powerless now. This is what I want to say about the Western politicians.
Michael, how do you reflect upon that? Because, you know, Monday morning is going to come around, and we've already heard from John Kerry that, you know, right after the referendum, we will make our big announcement. And from what Dima just said there's not any announcement's going to be, well, you know, an underestimation of what he probably has in his mind.
Right. I think, you know, the Cold War is over. It's not as easy to isolate countries, especially great powers. I think, you know, they may have some leverage with, you know, from the business aspect, from the sanctions. You know, in this world today, both, you know, Russia depends on Europe, Europe depends on Russia, and Europe, you know, they could hurt Russia in that regard with, you know, if they overdo it on sanctions. That may be a leverage point, but that would be stupid because they rely on Russian, you know, natural resources. So I think there has to be restraint. To start a sanctions war will lead to nowhere, and it will hurt. But there are some people like McCain that are willing to drive towards that. And I think, you know, it could cause some problems if all these, elites and these business and these industry leaders in Russia start getting their visas revoked everywhere they go, that's going to be problematic, and that's going to make the whole situation even worse. So I think there needs to be restraint.
Well,
I think there's a lot of
Go ahead, George.
rhetoric, hopefully.
Go ahead, George in London. Jump in.
Let me tell you that if they stop ultra-rich Russians coming to London to throw their platinum credit cards around Harrods and drive up the house prices for ordinary people in London, and stop Russian boys enrolling at the elite college at Eton, that's a good thing, so far as most British people are concerned.
Right. I always think that these guys will get
also
pissed off at Putin.
All right, let me jump in.
Even if they do, I think Putin is pretty angry with them. After all, why shouldn't Russia's wealth be spent in the development of Russia rather than the development of the London property market or buying clubs in the English Premiership? Let them buy clubs in Russia.
Oh, that's what Vladimir Putin says here. Demon, let me go back to you here in Moscow. I think one interesting angle of this is that China has come out very much on Russia's side. And I always am irritated when Western politicians say the international community says, well, no, that's just NATO and their friends. But China is coming out and saying, look, there are lines that you cannot cross here. And it's backing up Russia here. How is this changing the geopolitical order in your mind?
Well, I must tell you that I've heard from several Chinese friends of mine. They suddenly had the same impression about John Kerry's press conference that I had. I mean, the most recent press conference. And this impression was very positive. I mean, I understand that I sound strange, but it was very positive because for the first time in 15 years, we have heard from Mr. Kerry such words as legitimate Russian interests and multilateral approach, going to international organizations, observing international law. For 15 years, since the Yugoslav war in 1999, we haven't heard it from the United States. We only heard that the UN is outdated, international law is outdated, the United States is going to act unilaterally, Russia has no legitimate interest, China has no legitimate interest. So for the first time, the American Secretary of State speaks like a normal official in his situation. And Russia had to take this risky move. Russia had to basically, make this bold geopolitical step in order to make John Kerry speak like a normal human being. This is something that is going to be watched closely and appreciated in China, in India, probably even in Brazil.
Okay, George, but it looks like the horse is already out the gate here because, again, Mr. Kerry can talk all he wants, but actions are very, very different here. Again, the United States is the spotlight is on the fact that it doesn't respect international law and when it deals with the sovereign rights of other countries. I mean, one of the interesting things is that we keep hearing from the White House is that Russia should respect the sovereignty of Ukraine. Well, the coup doesn't respect sovereignty in Ukraine.
Look, I'm sitting 150 yards from the building that took a decision to invade and occupy country after country over the last decade. All those who mendaciously marched us into war and occupation around the world have no right to speak about anybody's infringement of anybody's national sovereignty. But in this case, it's especially absurd because, as you fleetingly referred, in Kosovo, which is a part of the Serbian state, the very same countries are doing everything that they can to separate Kosovo from Serbia and to accept its unilateral declaration of independence. And this all began with Tony Blair's Chicago speech, the Chicago Doctrine, where they basically trashed international law. They trashed the United Nations. They asserted their right to decide where and when to intervene, invade, occupy other people's countries. So I don't take seriously the political class of the Western countries or their media echo chamber. And President Putin hasn't fired a single shot in anger in Crimea. The Crimean people are putting an X on a piece of paper as we speak. What could be a more democratic, peaceful way of self-determining your own future than that.
Okay, Michael, I'm almost convinced that Mr. Putin is going to irritate everyone in the West by not saying anything about the vote for a while here. Where's Obama's position right now? We have people like McCain. He says McCain says about that Obama failed in Syria, he's failed in Ukraine. Is there going to be a backlash against Obama because the perception is he's very weak?
I think the perception is that he's weak, and sometimes people mistake that because he's judicious and deliberate in his thinking. And, I mean, maybe he's more like Putin in that regard. Maybe it seems like he doesn't like to make a lot of statements on this. And as George said earlier, and now I'm wondering, is his State Department kind of going rogue on him? Does Obama, I think his problem is he's not controlling the State Department properly. He's not controlling the message. And it's hard to understand what he really thinks, because he doesn't make a lot. He lets Kerry make all the statements, and, it sounds like they let Victoria run wild. So I think, if he sat down in a back room, Obama would love to, do some, I think he's a pragmatic liberal. So I think, we're going to get, from him, he has to take control of the situation and kind of tone it down, rein in his State Department. I think that's the problem right now. There's a disconnect, I think. He is deliberate, and that's what he gets, he gets accused of dithering, which is, no, he's thinking before he's acting. So, that's the way I see it.
All right, gents, fascinating discussion. We've run out of time. Many thanks to my guests in London, Washington, and in Moscow. And thanks to our viewers for watching us here at RT. See you next time. And remember, crosstalk rules.